The Lancaster bomber shouldn't have frightened anyone, or at least, that's what Luftwaffe pilots told themselves the first time they saw it in early 1942. Hermann Wilhelm Jonen, a decorated German night fighter ace, later admitted, "We called it the Fliegen Schune, the flying barn, because it looked like someone had strapped wings to a farmer's shed." The nickname wasn't praise. It was mockery, a way to dismiss what they didn't yet understand. To the Germans, the Lancaster looked oversized, clumsy, and slow, a box in the sky begging to be shot down. Measuring 69 feet long with a wingspan stretching over 100, it even dwarfed America's Flying Fortress. Its rectangular fuselage and massive cockpit gave it the shape of a barn more than a bomber. On moonlit nights, that canopy reflected like a country window, making it glow in the dark sky. Luftwaffe pilot Hans Rucker later recalled, "You could spot them from 5 kilometers away when the light was right. The cockpit glass flashed, and suddenly you had your target." But in war, nicknames often turn ironic, and the flying barn would soon make its mockers eat their words. By March 1942, the Royal Air Force had sent its first Lancasters into combat against the German battleship Tirpitz, and a month later, 12 flew a suicidal daylight raid over Augsburg. Only 5 made it home, but those 5 hit their target with brutal precision. Barns weren't supposed to fly like that, and certainly not fight like that. German intelligence had completely underestimated what the British had built. They thought the Lancaster was just another evolution of the RAF's earlier failures, the slow Hamptons, the fragile Wellingtons, the underpowered Manchesters. They couldn't have been more wrong. Beneath its boxy frame hid revolutionary engineering, a massive 33-foot bomb bay that could carry payloads no American bomber could fit, and a structure designed entirely for destructive purpose rather than appearance. Every inch of that so-called barn had been built to burn cities. By summer 1942, Luftwaffe crews across Europe were using Schune as shorthand for Lancaster formations, thinking they were easy kills. That arrogance wouldn't last long. By year's end, more than 200 Lancasters ruled the night sky, and German pilots began noticing something deeply unsettling. These barns simply refused to die. They took flak, cannon shells, engine fires, yet somehow kept formation and came back again and again. The laughter faded somewhere over the Ruhr Valley. 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines gave the Lancaster its heart, each one producing over 1,200 horsepower, dragging 65,000 pounds of steel and explosives deep into German territory. No German bomber could compare. Their Heinkel He 177s were notorious for catching fire mid-air, and their twin-engine designs couldn't match the Lancaster's reach or payload. That 4-engine configuration changed everything. It gave the Lancaster strength and survivability beyond anything the Luftwaffe had seen. It could lose 1 engine, sometimes even 2, and still fly. Oberleutnant Martin Becker once pumped 20 cannon shells into a Lancaster until 1 engine exploded in flames, yet it kept flying. "On 3 engines," he wrote later, "they maintained altitude and speed as though we had merely annoyed them." That resilience haunted German pilots for the rest of the war. The Merlin engines themselves became legends. Originally built for the Spitfire, they were almost unkillable. Even when hit by shrapnel or leaking coolant, they kept running. One Lancaster from 460 Squadron flew home from Germany in 1943 with an engine completely destroyed, the crankcase shattered, and still made it across 400 miles of open sea. But those same engines betrayed them too. The deep, thunderous hum of 4 Merlins carried for miles on still nights, and their red-hot exhausts created 4 glowing points in the dark, easy targets for night fighters watching from below. Even so, spotting a Lancaster didn't mean surviving the encounter. Each bomber bristled with up to 8.303 Browning machine guns mounted in tail, dorsal, and nose turrets. A pilot attacking one head-on, or from the rear was flying straight into a wall of fire. Luftwaffe crews faced a brutal choice: chase the massive, heavily armed Lancaster and risk being torn apart, or go after smaller, easier targets and let the barns level their cities. That impossible choice reached its peak on the night of May 16, 1943, the night of Operation Chastise, better known as the Dambusters Raid. 19 specially modified Lancasters from No. 617 Squadron lifted off from RAF Scampton under the command of Wing Commander Guy Gibson. Their mission: destroy the Merlin and Eder dams, two structures the Germans considered indestructible. Each Lancaster carried one weapon, Barnes-Wallis's revolutionary bouncing bomb, a 9,000-pound cylinder designed to skip across water and detonate against the dam walls. To succeed, the crews had to fly at just 60 feet above the reservoir, at night, guided only by two converging spotlights beneath their aircraft. It was one of the most daring operations in aviation history. At 12:28 a.m., Gibson's Lancaster released its bomb. It skipped perfectly across the surface, struck the dam, and exploded. The first blast cracked the wall. The fifth shattered it completely, releasing more than 300 million tons of water into the valley below. The Eder Dam fell soon after, releasing another 200 million tons. Power plants drowned, factories vanished, and entire villages were washed away. German Armaments Minister Albert Speer was woken in the middle of the night with the news. His reaction was one of horror. "If they can do this to our dams," he said, "what else have we assumed is safe?" 8 Lancasters didn't return that night, nearly half the attacking force, but their sacrifice changed everything. Operation Chastise didn't just destroy dams, it shattered Germany's confidence in its own defenses. The flying barn that the Luftwaffe once mocked had become a symbol of courage, innovation, and relentless British defiance. It was big, loud, and easy to find, yet unstoppable. A machine that turned ridicule into fear and wrote its name across the night sky in fire. By year's end, more than 200 Lancasters ruled the night sky, and German pilots began noticing something deeply unsettling. These barns simply refused to die. They took flak, cannon shells, engine fires, yet somehow kept formation and came back again and again. The laughter faded somewhere over the Ruhr Valley. 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines gave the Lancaster its heart, each one producing over 1,200 horsepower, dragging 65,000 pounds of steel and explosives deep into German territory. No German bomber could compare. Their Heinkel He 177s were notorious for catching fire mid-air, and their twin-engine designs couldn't match the Lancaster's reach or payload. That 4-engine configuration changed everything. It gave the Lancaster strength and survivability beyond anything the Luftwaffe had seen. It could lose one engine, sometimes even 2, and still fly. Oberleutnant Martin Becker once pumped 20 cannon shells into a Lancaster until one engine exploded in flames, yet it kept flying. "On 3 engines," he wrote later, "they maintained altitude and speed as though we had merely annoyed them." That resilience haunted German pilots for the rest of the war. The Merlin engines themselves became legends. Originally built for the Spitfire, they were almost unkillable. Even when hit by shrapnel or leaking coolant, they kept running. One Lancaster from 460 Squadron flew home from Germany in 1943 with an engine completely destroyed, the crankcase shattered, and still made it across 400 miles of open sea. But those same engines betrayed them too. The deep, thunderous hum of 4 Merlins carried for miles on still nights, and their red-hot exhausts created 4 glowing points in the dark, easy targets for night fighters watching from below. Even so, spotting a Lancaster didn't mean surviving the encounter. Each bomber bristled with up to 8.303 Browning machine guns mounted in tail, dorsal, and nose turrets. A pilot attacking one head-on, or from the rear, was flying straight into a wall of fire. Luftwaffe crews faced a brutal choice: chase the massive, heavily armed Lancaster and risk being torn apart, or go after smaller, easier targets and let the barns level their cities. That impossible choice reached its peak on the night of May 16, 1943, the night of Operation Chastise, better known as the Dambusters Raid. 19 specially modified Lancasters from No. 617 Squadron lifted off from RAF Scampton under the command of Wing Commander Guy Gibson. Their mission: destroy the Merlin and Eder dams, two structures the Germans considered indestructible. Each Lancaster carried one weapon, Barnes-Wallis's revolutionary bouncing bomb, a 9,000-pound cylinder designed to skip across water and detonate against the dam walls. To succeed, the crews had to fly at just 60 feet above the reservoir, at night, guided only by two converging spotlights beneath their aircraft. It was one of the most daring operations in aviation history. At 12:28 a.m., Gibson's Lancaster released its bomb. It skipped perfectly across the surface, struck the dam, and exploded. The first blast cracked the wall. The fifth shattered it completely, releasing more than 300 million tons of water into the valley below. The Eder Dam fell soon after, releasing another 200 million tons. Power plants drowned, factories vanished, and entire villages were washed away. German Armaments Minister Albert Speer was woken in the middle of the night with the news. His reaction was one of horror. "If they can do this to our dams," he said, "what else have we assumed is safe?" 8 Lancasters didn't return that night, nearly half the attacking force, but their sacrifice changed everything. Operation Chastise didn't just destroy dams, it shattered Germany's confidence in its own defenses. The flying barn that the Luftwaffe once mocked had become a symbol of courage, innovation, and relentless British defiance. It was big, loud, and easy to find, yet unstoppable. A machine that turned ridicule into fear and wrote its name across the night sky in fire. They weren't just reacting anymore, they were fighting back. The Lancaster gunners had become predators in their own right, and German pilots quickly learned that closing in for a kill often meant getting shot at first. The Junkers Ju-88 offered a different approach, especially the later variants equipped with Schrage music, upward-firing cannons mounted behind the cockpit at a 70-degree angle. This ingenious system allowed a night fighter to position directly beneath a bomber, match its speed, and fire upward into its belly without ever entering the gunner's line of sight. In theory, it was devastatingly effective. In practice, experienced Lancaster pilots developed a brutal countermaneuver known as the corkscrew, a violent spiraling dive that combined rolls and direction changes sharp enough to throw attackers off aim. Flight engineers described these evasive maneuvers as chaos incarnate. Loose tools floated weightless in zero gravity before slamming back down as the bomber pulled through the bottom of the dive. By early 1944, German night fighter tactics had evolved entirely around the Lancaster's behavior. Training manuals emphasized multiple pass attacks instead of single decisive strikes. Crews were taught to target vital systems, shoot out 2 engines on one wing to induce uncontrollable yaw, aim for the tailplane to cripple elevator control, or, if desperate, go for a head-on attack to kill the pilot outright. That last tactic bordered on suicidal, but it reflected a grim respect. Lancasters didn't die easily. They absorbed punishment, stayed airborne, and often delivered their payloads before crashing, or limped home with half their structure shredded. Each engagement drained time, fuel, and nerve from German pilots while exposing them to their own flak defensive gunfire from other bombers, or RAF Mosquito, intruders prowling the same skis to hunt the hunters. The predator-prey relationship had reached a fragile equilibrium. Germany's night fighters could find the Lancasters with radar precision, but destroying them remained an exhausting and dangerous gamble. Meanwhile, Lancaster crews lived with the constant dread that at any second, a 3-second burst of cannon fire from the darkness could end everything. The fear was mutual. The hunters feared the barn as much as the barn feared the hunters. Yet, the men inside those perspex greenhouses climbed back in, night after night, their courage becoming the stuff of legend. The Lancaster's bomb bay, stretching 33 feet long and entirely unobstructed by internal supports, seemed unremarkable at first, until engineer Barnes-Wallis began calculating what could fit inside. By 1944, those calculations birthed weapons so enormous that only the Lancaster could carry them. It transformed from a general-purpose heavy bomber into a precision siege weapon built to annihilate targets that conventional bombs couldn't even dent. Enter the Tall Boy and Grand Slam earthquake bombs, Wallis's masterpieces. These weren't just explosives, they were earth-shaking instruments of strategic terror. The Tall Boy entered service in June 1944, a 12,000-pound giant measuring 21 feet in length. It wasn't designed to explode on impact, but to burrow deep into earth or reinforced concrete before detonating, sending seismic shockwaves that shattered structures from within. To work, it had to be dropped from 18,000 feet, reaching terminal speeds of nearly 750 miles per hour. No other Allied bomber had the payload capacity or altitude performance to deliver such a weapon. The Lancaster did, and in doing so, redefined aerial warfare. When fitted with a Tall Boy, the bomber's silhouette changed dramatically. Its underbelly bulged with the weapon's enormous shape, instantly recognizable to German observers. Those sightings triggered immediate alerts. A Tall Boy meant a high-value target was about to vanish. On the night of June 8-9, 1944, 19 Lancasters from the famed 617 Squadron, the Dambusters, took off to strike the Somme Tunnel, a crucial rail link between occupied France and Germany. One bomb penetrated 60 feet of earth before detonating directly beneath the tunnel, collapsing it so completely that German engineers never managed to reopen it. Rail traffic had to be rerouted through longer, inefficient paths, delaying Wehrmacht reinforcements desperately needed in Normandy. That single raid demonstrated how the Tall Boy changed everything. Targets that once required hundreds of bombers and repeated attacks could now be destroyed with fewer than 20 precision strikes. Soon, even Germany's most fortified structures, the U-boat pens at Brest, La Pallice, and other Atlantic ports, found themselves vulnerable. The Kriegsmarine had believed those submarine shelters, with their reinforced concrete roofs up to 20 feet thick, were invincible. But the Lancaster, carrying Barnes Wallis's new breed of earth-shattering bombs, was about to prove them wrong. The U-boat pens were Germany's fortresses of steel and concrete, structures with roofs up to 20 feet thick that had withstood thousands of tons of conventional bombs between 1941 and 1943 with barely a scratch. Even the massive American daylight raids of 1943 did little more than scar the surrounding terrain, often losing dozens of B-17s to flak in the process. But on August 6, 1944, everything changed. Lancaster bombers from 617 Squadron attacked the submarine pens at Brest carrying Tall Boy bombs. 5 direct hits punched clean through the concrete roofs, something Allied analysts had previously declared impossible, collapsing internal structures and rendering the pens useless. Captured German officer Albert Scharr later admitted, "The U-boat pen attacks proved we had no sanctuary left. No matter how much concrete we poured, the British could still reach us." Then came the weapon that turned disbelief into despair, the Grand Slam. It was so colossal that German intelligence initially dismissed reports of its existence as Allied propaganda. Weighing 22,000 pounds, over 10 tons, and stretching more than 25 feet long, it was less a bomb than an engineered earthquake. Standard Lancasters couldn't carry it. Only specially modified versions, stripped of armor, fitted with strengthened undercarriages and boosted engines, could bear the load. These aircraft sacrificed every comfort and most of their defensive guns, becoming single-purpose delivery platforms for one devastating payload. The Grand Slam's first operational use came on March 14, 1945, against the Bielefeld Viaduct, a vital rail link that had survived countless previous bombing attempts. One Grand Slam struck near the viaduct's base, and the resulting seismic shock collapsed over 100 yards of reinforced structure into twisted rubble. Repair was impossible. The Germans abandoned the route entirely. What terrified defenders most wasn't just the size of these weapons, it was their precision. Both the Tall Boy and Grand Slam demanded pinpoint accuracy from high altitude, typically between 18,000 and 20,000 feet, to achieve the velocity and trajectory required for deep penetration. This demanded sophisticated bomb sights, expert bombardiers, and a rock-steady aircraft. The Lancaster, with its advanced automatic bomb sight and remarkably stable high-altitude handling, delivered exactly that. Crews would hold their course straight and level for 30 to 45 agonizing seconds during bombing runs, making micro-adjustments while tracers and flak filled the sky. German gunners learned to dread those moments because the Lancasters wouldn't flinch. Their commitment to accuracy meant accepting hits rather than dodging them. It was a chilling form of psychological warfare, an unspoken defiance that said, "We're not turning away." Even a near miss from these weapons had catastrophic effects. A single tall boy or grand slam could create an 80-foot deep crater nearly 100 feet wide. The ground shook for miles. Workers in nearby factories heard the explosions, felt the tremors, and understood that if the British wanted, a single bomb could erase their entire facility. German morale reports from early 1945 revealed widespread absenteeism following Grand Slam raids. Even undamaged sites saw workers refusing to return, convinced the next attack could collapse the entire complex in one strike. By early 1945, 617 Squadron and No. 9 Squadron had become elite precision units, specialists in delivering tall boy and Grand Slam missions. Their targets were the toughest Germany had left: bridges, viaducts, U-boat pens, and V-weapon launch sites, structures impervious to conventional bombing. The process was simple yet devastating. Intelligence identified a hardened target. The mission planners assigned the specialist squadrons. Days later, that target ceased to exist. This was something entirely new in military aviation: the precision destruction of fortified infrastructure. The Germans could disperse factories, move headquarters, or hide supply depots, but they couldn't relocate bridges or submarine pens. The Lancaster, armed with earthquake bombs, could reach anything fixed and erase it from existence. And in that grim arithmetic of destruction lay the Lancaster's true power. A typical heavy bomber raid might require 200 aircraft dropping 600 tons of explosives to inflict moderate damage. A single Grand Slam could achieve the same result against a specific target, while risking only one crew. From the German perspective, that made the Lancaster not just a bomber, but a nightmare. You couldn't predict where it would strike. You couldn't defend against its weapons. And once it hit, you couldn't rebuild. The flying barn that Luftwaffe pilots once mocked had become a machine of selective annihilation, a weapon of surgical destruction wrapped in steel and courage. The Lancaster's wartime record tells a story of brutal endurance. Between 1942 and 1945, Bomber Command lost 3,249 Lancasters to enemy action, an astonishing 43% of all built. By comparison, the Halifax suffered a 34% loss rate, while the older Sterling reached nearly 50% before being withdrawn from service. Statistically, the Lancaster was neither the safest nor the deadliest bomber in the sky. Yet it flew 156,000 operational sorties and dropped over 608,000 tons of bombs, more than any other British bomber by a massive margin. It created a strange paradox for both sides. The Germans shot down Lancasters in large numbers, yet never enough to change the outcome. No matter how many they destroyed, more always came. Loss rates varied wildly depending on weather, target, and tactics. During the disastrous Nuremberg raid of March 30–31, 1944, Bomber Command dispatched 795 aircraft, including 572 Lancasters. Clear skies and bright moonlight gave German night fighters perfect conditions. They destroyed 95 bombers, 71 of them Lancasters, a horrifying 12.4% loss rate. Yet, just weeks later, those same squadrons were back over Germany, flying missions with losses below 2%. The Lancaster's secret wasn't invincibility, it was endurance. It could be bloodied, battered, and burned, but it always came back. And in that endurance lay its legacy, a symbol of unrelenting persistence that broke the backbone of Nazi Germany's war machine. One night at a time, Havro's Chatham factory and dozens of shadow factories across Britain were producing Lancaster bombers faster than Germany could shoot them down. In 1943 alone, British industry rolled out 2,126 Lancasters, while total losses reached just 146. Even during the height of the bombing campaign, the number of operational Lancasters kept climbing month after month. German intelligence officers monitoring Bomber Command's order of battle watched in disbelief as squadron numbers grew, from just 44 operational aircraft in January 1942 to more than 700 by January 1944. No matter how many they destroyed, more seemed to appear out of the mist. For the crews, the experience was a cruel paradox. Flying a Lancaster was both an honor and a near-death sentence. A typical crew faced a 44% chance of being killed and a 12% chance of ending up in a German prison camp during a standard 30-mission tour. Statistically, fewer than half would complete their tour unscathed. Flight engineer Norman Ashton of 467 Squadron later described the grim calculation every crewman silently made. You knew the odds. You'd seen planes go down and never come back. You'd watched new crews arrive, then vanish within weeks. But you also knew that some did survive, and you convinced yourself you'd be one of them. What else could you do? By mid-1943, this grim arithmetic was common knowledge across Bomber Command. Yet, volunteers continued to line up for duty faster than losses could thin their ranks. The Lancaster's reputation for surviving incredible damage helped sustain morale. Many returned home with gaping holes in their fuselage, shredded tails, or entire engines blown apart, still flying somehow. One photo from a debriefing shows Lancaster ED-88, riddled with holes, yet proudly taxiing home. One aircraft, nicknamed Admiral Prune, completed an astonishing 140 operations between 1942 and 1945, a feat that defied every statistic. Tailies like that spread fast. Every time crews heard stories of Lancasters limping home against impossible odds, it strengthened their faith that skill, teamwork, and a touch of luck might just beat death. The Lancaster wasn't seen as fragile. It was tough, almost mythic. That reputation mattered more than anyone realized. For the Germans, this paradox became a nightmare of strategy. Night fighter squadrons and flak batteries were destroying 40 to 50 Lancasters each month in 1943 and 1944, numbers that should have crippled the RAF. But instead of dwindling, the raids grew in size, accuracy, and destruction. British factories kept producing. Crews grew more experienced. New radar and targeting systems improved precision. Luftwaffe commanders were trapped in a losing equation. They were winning battles but losing the war. Every Lancaster they downed was replaced, and often by a better trained crew. Bomber Command system was designed for resilience. Even with a 44% loss rate, operations never slowed. Across Britain, conversion units trained replacement crews continuously. Veterans passed on their hard-earned lessons to the next wave of airmen. By 1944, new crews could be combat-ready within weeks, familiar with the Lancaster's systems, tactics, and procedures. Early in the war, that would have been unthinkable. Now, it was a production line of both machines and men. This relentless tempo had a psychological effect, too. For German defenders, shooting down one Lancaster brought no comfort, because the next night 50 more would come. Propaganda on the home front tried to celebrate each victory, but even civilians began to question the point. If we destroyed 20 bombers last night, they asked, why was our city still in flames this morning? That was the true power of the Lancaster, not just its bombs, but its unshakable momentum. The aircraft became a symbol of inevitability. Even though nearly half of all Lancasters built were lost in action, they still delivered 2/3 of Bomber Command's total bomb tonnage. No other British heavy bomber came close. Each Lancaster dropped more bombs, flew more missions, and hit more targets than the Halifax, Sterling, or any rival. It was both vulnerable and invincible, feared by its crews, yet trusted by commanders who had no better weapon. The clearest proof of German fear came not from propaganda, but from captured Luftwaffe personnel. Interrogation reports, declassified decades later, tell a striking story. German pilots respected American daylight raids for their precision and escorts, but they dreaded the Lancaster's night raids. It wasn't just about the bombs. It was the exhaustion, the feeling of being hunted by something you couldn't see. One ace, Oberst Verstress, with 65 confirmed kills, told Allied interrogators in May 1945, "Fighting the Americans was combat dangerous, but logical. Fighting the Lancasters at night was like hunting ghosts that burned your cities while you hunted them." At the Luftwaffe's own interrogation center, Duleg Luft, Allied intelligence recorded dozens of similar accounts. In one 1943 meeting, General Joseph Kamhuber asked his night fighter pilots which bomber they most feared. The answer was unanimous: the Lancaster, especially when they come in full streams. Halifax formations, they said, were smaller and easier to attack. Sterlings were slower, easier targets. American B-17s flew predictable routes in daylight. But the Lancasters came at night, hundreds of them, scattered, unpredictable, unstoppable. Even German flak units on the ground echoed that fear. One report from Frankfurt in February 1944 described entire batteries firing blindly into the sky, overwhelmed by the scale of the attack. It wasn't just an air war anymore. It was a battle against an industrial machine that refused to stop, no matter the cost. German reports began describing their engagement frustrations in unusually blunt terms. Lancaster formations, they noted, maintained altitude and speed even through the heaviest anti-aircraft barrages, patterns that would have scattered other bombers. Predictive fire systems assumed that pilots would take evasive action, yet Lancaster crews often held their course, prioritizing bombing accuracy over survival. This defiance reduced the effectiveness of flak batteries, as German gunners consistently overestimated their chances of a direct hit. Requests soon followed for increased ammunition allocations, specifically for Lancaster raids, as standard defensive fire proved inadequate against such disciplined formations. Perhaps most revealing were the accounts from German civilians who had witnessed Lancaster attacks firsthand. A series of interviews conducted by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey in 1945 included the testimony of August Schmidt, a shift supervisor at the Krupp Works in Essen. Schmidt described how his reaction to air raids evolved over the years. Early in the war, he recalled, you heard the sirens and felt concern, but not terror. The bombs fell randomly. Damage was limited. By 1943, when the Lancasters came in strength, everything changed. You knew they would find the factory. You knew the bombs would hit. The sound of their engines, that deep rumble of hundreds approaching, became worse than the explosions themselves because it meant hours of sustained attack were coming. The unique acoustic signature of Lancaster formations appears repeatedly in German testimonies. Unlike American bombers, whose high-pitched radial engines whined through daylight skies, the Lancaster's 4 Merlin engines produced a deep, rhythmic throb that penetrated walls, shelters, and nerves alike. Civilians in Berlin, Hamburg, and Cologne reported hearing them for 10 to 15 minutes before the first bombs fell, a prolonged anticipation that magnified their fear. Luftwaffe sound-dranging operators noted that Lancaster noise carried farther than expected, possibly due to the synchronized resonance of its 4 engines. This eerie warning created a paradox. It offered time to prepare, yet the waiting became unbearable. Knowing they were coming, but not when or where they would strike, shredded morale long before the explosions began. German command communications reveal how deeply this anxiety spread through leadership ranks. A memo from Generaloberst Hans-Eugen Stumpf, commander of Luftflotte Reich in late 1944, addressed resource priorities. Stumpf noted that while American daylight raids drew more attention from high command due to their visibility and political impact, it was the sustained night offensive by Lancasters that posed the greater strategic threat to both war production and civilian morale. American raids, he wrote, are surgical strikes that can be defended through concentration. Lancaster attacks are sledgehammer blows distributed across time and geography. He recommended shifting night fighter resources from coastal intercept zones toward direct target defense, acknowledging that stopping Lancaster streams before they reached their objectives had proven nearly impossible. The experiences of surviving German night fighter crews reinforced this grim assessment. Heinz-Wolfgang Schnaufer, Germany's top-scoring night fighter ace with 121 victories, described Lancaster formations as professionally flown, disciplined, and unbreakable. You couldn't pick off stragglers, he said, because they rarely broke formation. The rear gunners were alert and aggressive. Most remarkably, the Lancasters kept coming, no matter how many we shot down. We might destroy 20 in one night, and 2 nights later the same number would return. Schnaufer's reluctant admiration carried weight, coming from a man who had sent hundreds of Lancaster crews to their deaths. By 1944, younger Luftwaffe personnel viewed Lancaster raids not as isolated battles but as a fact of life. Lieutenant Franz Stigler, captured after bailing out over Holland in March 1945, described it this way: "You stopped thinking about individual raids. You started thinking about the siege, the constant exhaustion, the broken sleep, the fear for your family. The Lancaster wasn't just an aircraft. It was a symbol of our failure to defend the Reich." That psychological toll proved more damaging than the physical destruction. Post-war debriefings confirmed this view. When asked which aspect of the Allied bombing campaign had been most effective, several high-ranking German commanders pointed not to American precision raids, but to the relentless Lancaster assaults. Field Marshal Erhard Milch, who oversaw aircraft production, put it bluntly: "The Americans hurt our factories. The British, with their Lancasters, broke our workers. They couldn't sleep. They couldn't feel safe. They couldn't produce." Factories could be rebuilt, but morale, once shattered, could not. By war's end, the Lancaster had become both a weapon and a psychological phenomenon. Its operational record tells a brutal story. Lancaster squadrons flew 156,000 sorties and dropped over 608,000 tons of bombs, losing 3,249 aircraft in the process. By comparison, the Halifax flew half as many missions and dropped less than half the tonnage. Statistically, each Lancaster lost had delivered an average of 187 tons of bombs before its destruction, a grim but effective efficiency unmatched by any other bomber of the war. The Lancaster's design philosophy: maximize payload, accept moderate defenses, and rely on formation strength, defied conventional wisdom yet reshaped it entirely. The United States, once devoted to the heavily armed flying fortress concept of the B-17, later adopted Lancaster-inspired principles in its post-war bombers. The B-36 Peacemaker and B-52 Stratofortress prioritized payload and range over defensive armament, marking a doctrinal victory for the flying barn. Lancasters proved remarkably adaptable beyond their bombing role. They flew maritime patrols, electronic warfare missions, photo reconnaissance, and even early nuclear test monitoring. Modified variants dropped the first 12,000 and 22,000-pound bombs and pioneered low-level marking techniques that changed how targets were struck. The aircraft remained in service until 1963, 18 years after the war's end, an extraordinary lifespan for a wartime design. But that legacy came at a staggering human cost. Of roughly 125,000 airmen who served in Bomber Command, 55,573 were killed in action, a 44% fatality rate, higher than that of British infantry. Most flew Lancasters. These men climbed into freezing, unheated aircraft night after night, facing flak and night fighters that killed without warning. Their courage built the Lancaster's reputation as much as its engineering did. The evidence of their work scarred German cities for decades. Hamburg's firestorm of July 1943 killed over 40,000 people. Dresden's reconstruction took into the 1990s. Cologne's cathedral stood amid ruins for years, a monument to destruction and endurance alike. Whether those raids were justified remains one of history's most bitter debates. What's beyond debate is that the Lancaster made them possible on an unprecedented scale. By war's end, the nickname Flying Barn, once a sneer, had transformed into a backhanded tribute. German veterans later spoke of the Lancaster with respect, even reverence, acknowledging it as a worthy and terrifying opponent. The aircraft that looked ungainly and vulnerable had become the most feared bomber of the war. The Lancaster's final missions in April 1945 brought its story full circle. During Operation Manna, thousands of Lancasters dropped food to starving Dutch civilians, flour, chocolate, and tinned meat instead of explosives. The same aircraft that once rained destruction now delivered hope. It was a fitting conclusion for a machine that had embodied both the brutality and the humanity of total war. Today, only 2 Lancasters remain airworthy, one in Britain, one in Canada, each drawing massive crowds wherever they fly. The deep, steady roar of 4 Merlin engines still sends shivers through those who hear it. 8 decades on, the Lancaster remains more than an aircraft. It is a symbol of endurance, sacrifice, and the industrial will that reshaped the modern world. Whether it represents heroism or horror depends on who remembers it, but everyone agrees. The Flying Barn earned its legend not through appearance, but through unstoppable purpose.